Our next religion is the amazing religion of Hinduism, which we're going to cover over 2 days. This particular lecture covers both of them, so you only have to listen to one lecture for it. The quiz, meanwhile, will be on the second day of the discussion, and it covers this lecture and the 2 days worth of readings. We're going to begin with a little historical background of Hinduism. It really is the first historical religion of mankind that's still around today. Hinduism begins, we don't even know exactly when, but scholars usually say with Indus Valley Civilization around 2500 BC. So it certainly rivals religion in the Middle East, and it's clear that there existed a religion in India before the Indus Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization came from the Aryans who migrated from the northwest down into India. And there are all kinds of theories about how this worked, but the Aryans were lighter skinned. Aryans brought with them a Indo-European language, which is going to have cognates to Greek and Latin. And Aryans are not the same thing as Hitler's Aryans. There's a great quote from Tolkien when he's asked by the Germans when he attempts to publish a book whether he's Aryan or not, and he says something like, well, if you mean a person who migrated into India, no. If you mean if I'm of a German race or something, I'm sad to say I don't belong to that noble race of Semitic people, which is the Jews. The reason he was asked this is because, given his name, I think that people suspect that he might have been a Jew. Well, at any rate, Aryans are not the same as Aryans of Hitler. And they migrated into India, and the confluence of that, along with the prior culture, created the great religion of Hinduism. And it takes its name from the Indus Valley, the Hindus. Now, another thing that's interesting, there's this great documentary by a guy named Michael Wood, a historian, called The Story of India, which at least was free on Amazon Prime, and it's about 6 hours long. He goes through in a great HD presentation of the history of India. And one of the things that I remember relevant to this is in South India, they did DNA tests on the people, and they found that they were an exact match for the people in Africa, where scientists believe that mankind first originated. So there was a migration down there to South India, and indeed you can see by looking at the people how they look like they're basically African down in the south. And their language too, they analyze some of these native sounds that they're making, and they don't even understand the meaning, but they've been passed down by the priests, and the philologist said that it most resembles the language of birds. The Rig Veda then, which is the oldest of Hindu texts, is among the oldest of Earth's religious extant texts that we still possess. It probably dates to the 20th century BC at least, although the manuscripts we possess for it don't come until the 14th century AD. And I mention that just to give you an appreciation. That's 3,400 years before, between its being written and when we have evidence for it in written form, because the copies of the copies of the copies were lost, and we're left with a copy 3,000 years later. Whereas in the Bible, we don't have an original autograph, the original piece off of St. Paul's hand, but we possess documents within the first couple decades after they were composed. Hinduism itself is an umbrella term. There is no one Hinduism. This is a term invented by scholars, essentially. They refer to their religion as Sanatana Dharma, which scholars like to translate as eternal law. It is the complete governance of your life, and it has to do with everything. When we talked about primal religions, we saw there was no word for religion because everything was religious. And here you have a slide showing the population of Hindus throughout the world. You can see that they're dominant in India and a few other countries. India is majority Hindu, but it has a decent Muslim population and a small Christian population, which is mostly in South India. There are three layers of Hinduism, which you might call geological layers, to help you appreciate the development of this religion over time. Like I said, it's an umbrella term, so you have many different traditions which get lumped together as Hinduism because they have similar dominant patterns and concepts. Well, the original was Vedic. The Vedas are the manuals for how to perform priestly rituals, and the primary mode of worship or devotion then was the fire sacrifice. Many of the Vedic gods you read about are gods of nature and forces that resemble Greco-Roman gods. But then, once the religion begins to leave the confines of myth, as in the categories given us by Ratzinger earlier in the course, it goes to enlightenment or philosophy. And then you get the Upanishads. The Upanishads are the principal philosophical texts, but they're also very mystical. The primary type of prayer at this point is meditation. We're talking about the 6th or 5th century BC, roughly in that axial age when you also had the Hebrew prophets, you had Buddha and Confucius and Lao Tzu. And if you want to give this a parallel in Judaism, the Jews during the exile at that same time in history realized that with the temple destroyed, God didn't want sacrifice of animals primarily, but he wanted the sacrifice of a contrite heart, and that the true altar on which you worship is your heart. Similar findings here that the Hindus come to when they go out in the forest and meditate and write these Upanishads. The more modern movement, which comes on the scene probably toward the time of Christ and forward, is devotional Hinduism, and the primary epic is called the Mahabharata. There's a great production of this by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and part of the Mahabharata is called the Bhagavad Gita, which many regard as basically the Bible for Hindus. For Mahatma Gandhi, the New Testament and the Bhagavad Gita were his two main guides. And there are other great myths, but perhaps the other most important one is the Ramayana, which is the story of this god Rama, and I'll talk about it a little later. Currently in devotional Hinduism, people perform a puja, which is a series of offerings to the gods, cakes, bananas, fire, and these type of things that weds together some of the old concepts, but it's a very popular form of worship and anybody can do it. And you have the worship of thousands of different gods, and people will choose which ones are the ones they will be devoted to. I want to tell you a little story about a puja I experienced in Delhi. So we arrive in India, and you've been on the plane 24 hours or something like that. You're dead tired. Well, what do? I get into bed at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, India time, and wake up around 5. Nobody else is awake, and it's usually my luck to not sleep like that. So I go downstairs, and the keeper of the hotel is asleep down there in the little foyer of the hotel, and he sees me come down, and he stands alert immediately and is ready to get me some breakfast. Amazing service. Not a Ritz-Carlton hotel, but you can see the duty of these people and how they hold to it. So I have a couple cups of coffee, and I walk outside. It's 6 a.m. now, and it is blistering hot, crazy traffic and smog. Just down the street from us is this massive temple you're going to see a picture of later to the god Hanuman, the monkey. And I decided to walk down and risk my life on the Delhi streets, and I walked down it and see the entrance to it as a mouth with fangs. I thought, maybe I won't go by myself. Well, later in the day, our group went, and we go inside, and it's this series of different rooms and altars and chanting going on, incense, and we go up, and there's this certain area, and they usher us into a corner with an altar, and they kind of speak English. A lot of people do there in India, but the communication is not perfectly clear. And he starts to do a puja with us, and they rope us off, and they're sitting here observing it. And he ties a little band around our wrists, and wants us to wave our hands or something. Of course, we can't do that, so we didn't. But he touches us with a feather, and Really interesting stuff. He wants to paint a third eye on us, which I actually let him do. I don't think it was going to hurt anything. But at the end of it, after we observed that, some people were freaked out. Some people were like, that is really cool. He asked us for money, and I can't remember how many rupees it was, but it was about $5 that he wanted for the service. So you pay the priests there. It's still that way. These guys are laymen who act as priests and make a living off of it, and I might say will even rip you off if you're an ignorant foreigner. But it also goes to show how Hindus are very pluralistic and want you to worship with them, not just to make money, but that's very different than the Muslim style of worship, where when you go into some mosques, they're very reticent to even let you in. And we had people almost getting sick because it's 110 degrees in Delhi, and we're out here that same afternoon waiting for to get into the Jama Masjid Mosque, which is this incredible mosque, but they wouldn't let us in while prayers are going on, so people are out here about to faint for an hour in the Delhi heat. Now let's talk about the goals of life in Hinduism. Smith discusses a few different ones that don't work out eventually, and then the main one that people are fulfilled by. Hinduism says you get what you want, and you can follow what you want because it has confidence that you'll eventually find the path. The first goal people pursue is called kama, or pleasure. You've heard the term Kama Sutra, a book that deals with sexual postures and things that they use to achieve union with the divine. But this pleasure does not satisfy ultimately because it's too trivial. It's not enough to fill your heart, and it's private. You can't share it. It's like if you have a row of cookies in a plate at a party, there are only so many chocolate chip ones to go around, and then the other people can't be satisfied. But again, Hinduism doesn't say you can't follow the pleasure. It has confidence you'll realize that it doesn't fulfill you. 2 is worldly success. If you want to have power and fame, pursue it. But yet this doesn't ultimately satisfy either, because you can't take it with you. It fades. And this reminds me of what Jesus says in Luke 12:20. God says to this man who's been storing up food in his barns, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" It's not sinful, but it's childish to want to have things. And as people go older, you move from the youth who desire pleasure to the middle-aged who desire power to the old who desire security. And each one of these ages tends to make something its idol. It's childish, though. How do you get out of this rut? When you cry vanity. The critical point in life comes whenever we realize the insufficiency of self-centeredness. This, Smith says, announces the birth of religion in the soul. It's the Ecclesiastes moment. If you've never read this book of Ecclesiastes, I highly recommend it. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Life without God, life without service to the other, at a certain point, you just lose it. You're not fulfilled. So this leads us to the third goal in life, community. Doing your dharma, that is to say, your duty for others. Here you embark on the path of renunciation, where you're not seeking primarily to be fulfilled, but to help others. Yet even here, Smith says it doesn't fulfill you. Because, as St. Paul says, this world is passing away. All the good things you try to build up, even if they're not self-centered, they pass. And I want to tell you a little story about Father Victor Mosley, who is an Italian priest and a Xaverian missionary in Sierra Leone, Africa. And this guy escaped from the child soldiers who had been brainwashed and drugged twice. He had formerly taught them, and then they capture him, and they beat him, and all these different things. Well, the schools he had spent decades working to build, whenever this regime comes in and makes child soldiers, it all goes up in flames by the very people he taught. And can you imagine all the good you do on this earth, and then it just is lost? You spend 10 years working on a book, and then your computer crashes and somehow you never saved it or something. That does happen to people. And when that vanity moment occurs, people are driven to prayer to inquire, what do they really want? People really want infinite being, infinite knowledge, and infinite bliss, say the Hindus. This is man's last end, his goal. The term Satchidananda refers to those three categories: being, knowledge, and bliss. Some scholars will link this to the three attributes of the Trinity. I think it's a very loose parallel, but they would link being to the origin of the Godhead, the Father, knowledge to the Son, the Logos, and bliss or happiness with the love, the Holy Spirit. We might say it is a brief or small intimation that would prepare one for the gospel. When you realize that you are divine, I am thee, how Ratzinger put it, then you achieve moksha, liberation. That's your ultimate goal. The liberation or moksha wherein you attain infinite being, knowledge, and bliss. This leads us to discuss what the nature of the soul is for a Hindu. They don't call it soul, they say that you have an Atman. The center of yourself, with a little s self, is in reality the big S self, the universal self, the Godhead. Your Atman, your soul, is Brahman, God, at its very center. And Hinduism is going to try to drive you to the point of figuring that out and realizing that your center is really God. Various expressions they use to bring this out. There's a story we're going to talk about, Tattavam Asi, thou art that. And it's great, there's this boy and his father, and the boy thinks he's all learned, and his father says, I'm going to teach you how God really is, basically. And he puts some salt and water, and he asks the boy, taste it. What does it taste like? It tastes like salt, the boy says. Well, where is salt? Why can't you observe it? And it ends up that the dad says, this is like the Atman. It's an invisible essence that pervades all things and makes them to be what they are. But you can't sense it. You have to experience it to understand that that is Brahman, that your infinite center is God. So thou art that, the Father tells him. You are that being God. Another expression is soham. This is emphatic form of aham, I. You could translate it as I myself, or I am. It is I. This is similar to Christ, who says, I am. Every Hindu is Christ, essentially. Christ isn't unique because every person is divine by nature, and then they just have to realize they're divine. Another expression you use when you greet other people is namaste, which you may have seen in popularized culture. This means I greet the God within you. You fold your hands and bow towards them. A lot more profound greeting than just, hey, or what's up. Namaste. I recognize the God within you. I have here an image of a sun coming through the clouds in its rays. This is the best image I can give you for Atman and Brahman. Brahman is the sun. We are its rays for a Hindu. We are the same substance as the sun, but we're its extension into space and time, into our universe. So with that in place, we've got the nature of God, that God can't be spoken, who man is. Man really is God. Now let's look at man's real rut in our problem. Our problem of not realizing we're God stems from two things: Leela, which means play, and Maya, which means illusion. Sometimes people misinterpret this to think that the world doesn't exist, that it's Maya or illusion. That's not what Hindus are really saying. It's an illusion to think that created things are independent of God. This is practical atheism that we all sometimes succumb to. You go through a day and you don't think of God. You're living in Maya, or an illusion, the Hindu would say. There's a tough question for a Hindu we ought to raise. If you're God and you have the attributes of God, like infinite knowledge, being, and bliss, how is it that you can forget your God? It seems to be contradictory. Their answer is it's simply a mystery. It's God's Leela, or play. We don't know why he does it, but it's his good pleasure to decide to become foolish, to become ignorant, in order to find himself again. And we might dismiss that as just stupid, but didn't Christ do something similar? He emptied himself, Paul says in Philippians 2, and took the form of a slave, being born in the likeness of men. We wouldn't say that Christ forgot he was God, but he did have to grow in age, wisdom, and knowledge. So again, we don't think this is equivalent to Christ, but I think it's profound to see how they're getting on to something here. Then there's an important distinction between in God, God as we can know him and God as we can't know him. This is Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. Saguna Brahman is God with attributes, the God you can relate to. Nirguna Brahman is God without attributes, the God that's beyond all your concepts. Does this sound familiar? It should, because it's basically the same distinction we found in Native American tradition between God as Father and God as Grandfather. God the Father would be equivalent to Saguna Brahman, and Nirguna would be the grandfather. The Hindus have another great expression to describe their point here, neti neti, which means not this, not that. If you try to look at a created thing and say, this is God, neti, no, not this. This is God, neti, not that. Anything you try to point to with your mind ultimately falls short of God, just as we saw in Taoism. The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. As we try to achieve moksha, the thing we're trying to get out of is the cycle of rebirth, which is called samsara, reincarnation. I put up here a picture of the wheel of life, actually from a Buddhist tradition, but the Hindus accept the same cyclical view. You see, people get what they want for Hinduism, and if what you must want is this world, then you get it. So you get to be reborn in this world if you're clinging to this world. You enter samsara, the cycle of life, via the law of karma. Karma is energy or work. It's basically the law of action and reaction. And that means that if you do a bad deed, you're going to get punished for it. And you're going to get brought back into the cycle of rebirth. Unlike in the West and New Age, as we'll see later, rebirth is not a good thing for the Hindu. They do not want that. So they're trying to get out of samsara and to break the law of karma. My Hindu friend, I was asking about karma, and he says that suffering is due to karma, and it is our own fault. And that's used as a justification for the caste system, because people find themselves in a bad situation in life due to prior life sins. But yet he also recognized that suffering can be a gift from God, like we recognize in Christianity. Here you have a swastika. You may think, wow, Hitler got here to India? No, the swastika way predates Hitler. It's a symbol of peace, of prosperity, and also it represents the cyclical nature of the world and of man's life. It's put in motion, just like the yin-yang is in Taoism. So it embraces all of reality and brings it around and around. And speaking of around and around, my colleague gave me this hilarious cartoon. Look at this boy and what he tells his grandpa there. Yeah, well, I didn't believe in reincarnation when I was your age either. Do you get it? The young boy is actually older than his grandfather. Next comes the path by which you get out of this cycle of rebirth, and that is called the yogas. Everybody in the West today knows about yoga, the physical exercise. But there's much, much more philosophically and religiously to yoga than people think. Yogas are the means to end moksha, to end samsara, to achieve the end or goal of moksha. So let me rephrase that. Yogas are the means to end samsara so as to achieve your end or goal of moksha. Moksha means liberation. This isn't mere pretzel twisting. It means to unite with God, and the root yoga is the same as the English yoke. Thus I put up the picture of a yoke. Jesus says, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." These then are paths by which you unite yourself to God. There are 4 different main types of yogas, and the one you follow depends upon your personality type. You can combine paths, and it doesn't really matter because all paths lead up the same mountain. If you're a reflective person and philosophical, you'll practice jnana yoga. If you're emotional and devotional and the senses appeal to you, you choose bhakti. If you're active and physical, karma. If you're the person that likes to experiment, you do raja. And these are different than what might be called hatha yoga, just the exercise of bodily control. There's a moral preliminary that you had to follow here. And really there's several. Non-injury, non-stealing, practicing truth, self-control, cleanliness, commitment, and desire to reach your goal. These aren't commandments like in Christianity. You don't sin if you fail to do them. But the yoga is just not going to take if you don't perform these things as prerequisites. First we have jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. It's not factual knowledge. It's not just factoids about God, but a gaze of transformative intuition. The term jnana is cognate to the Greek gnosis. That is, this secret penetrating knowledge into God. It's epitomized in the phrase, "We are what we think." You know you are what you eat. In a sense, literally, you take the food and transform it into yourself when you metabolize it. But you're more what you think. Your character is determined by the virtues you've built up and the thoughts you have. So to convert your thinking to God is hard. It's the shortest path, but the steepest path towards moksha or liberation. And there are really 3 basic steps here. The first is to learn your true nature, that you are God. Your Atman is Brahman. Then you have to constantly think and try to be convinced of this. And then to finally shift your own self-identification from the lowercase s self to the uppercase s self. To speak even without using the term my and I. Because if you use those terms, it always implies a distinction. I'm different than you, but we're really all the same, you see. We're all part of the same stuff. We would raise a challenge here to Hinduism, I think, though. Isn't the fact that human language distinguishes with I and you, and that all languages seem to do this, an indication that reality itself entails distinctions? I mean, if you have to force yourself so hard to the point where you really can't even speak, maybe you're not correct. Maybe we all are one, but we're also distinct somehow. That's what Christianity is going to say. And our goal in life is to become perfectly united with each other and with God, but we don't lose our personality and our individuality for Christians. Next comes karma yoga, the path of action. Here you find God in everyday life if you go about your business as an offering to God. Smith says that a person completely at the disposal of others barely exists. And I would proffer Mother Teresa as an example here of someone who barely exists because she would just show Christ to people, not herself. Maybe you know a humble servant who doesn't ever seek to glorify themselves, but just wants to help others and show God. That, for the Hindu, would be karma yoga. A famous Hindu phrase is, do without attachment the work you have to do. And this is extremely similar to what the Taoists say about detachment and letting results come no matter what you want to happen. And so just as we did with Taoism, I'm going to compare karma yoga to Christianity and its spirituality. Actions are seen as prompted by the God's own will. And so the karma yoga is going to say, my work, what I'm doing here and giving this lecture, or you as a student doing your vocation, is God's own desire for you. And so we have to seek out to know what His will is and put it into action in our work. And for a Christian, this would be the inspirations of the Holy Spirit. God speaks to you. He's constantly trying to get you to do something if you just tune into His frequency and respond. They also say, calmly do each thing as if it is the only thing to be done. This here also teaches the sacrament of the present moment. Focus. Don't worry about the future or the past. And this phrase, which I picked up first in Christianity, is a big help in meditation for me. Don't worry about that huge list of things or that decision that's going to have to be made. Find God in the present. And then finally, in the Bhagavad Gita, we have this text that says, one to me is loss or gain, whether I live or whether I die. This is interior indifference and detachment, that no matter what happens, you're going to live on forever. And for a Christian, we shouldn't fear death because we'll live eternally and be rewarded in the resurrection. The Hindu puts a different twist on that. They think, well, I am God and you can't destroy me. This body is Maya or illusion, and I'll get a different body or I'll enter moksha. Next we have Raja Yoga, the royal path, which Smith describes as taking place through a series of psychophysical experiments. That is, experiments involve the body and the soul. And you have an experimental hypothesis you want to prove, namely that the self is a layered entity with sheaths. You're trying to prove the dogma of Hinduism that you are Brahman. What are the sheaths? Think of these again as layers of an onion or a corn stalk or something. The outermost sheath is your body. But if you peel that away in meditation, and you can stop thinking about all the feelings and itches and whatnot you have, you get to consciousness, your thoughts. But you also have a subconscious, things that are going on without you even realizing it. Once you can strip away even the subconscious, you can realize that you are being itself. So beyond all those different changeable things that are always in flux and constantly in motion, there is your self with a capital S. Let's talk briefly about the steps of Raja Yoga. There are certain things you have to abstain from, just as we saw that there are moral preliminaries at the very beginning of our discussion of the yogas. There's certain things you had to practice, observances. There's the lotus position, with sitting Indian style, so to speak. There's proper breathing, and people who do yoga know that. And then you have to close the doors of perception to cut out the outside noise if you're going to be able to then concentrate. I like what St. Josemaria Escrivá says about concentration. The average mind is like a drunken mucky, or as Escrivá puts it, the madman of the house. If you seriously sit down and try to pray for 15 minutes, your mind will go 50 different places. It's uncontrollable, it's crazy. But nevertheless, for a Christian, you have to try to sit down and just be with God, and same thing with the Hindu. This leads to meditation. In meditating, after having reached concentration, yourself drops out and you experience an identity with the Lord, with God. That experience of identity is called samadhi, literally with the Lord. This is the foretaste of moksha, or liberation, for the Hindu on earth. And it's a perfect stillness and peace where all of your conscious thoughts, your subconscious, and your bodily feelings are gone. The Upanishads describe this as the dreamless sleep state. It's our best created analogy we have. Your waking state, you're aware of your body and your thoughts. In dreaming, you're less aware. There's a subconscious aspect to it, but even then, you're still active. But in deep sleep, when you have no dreams, this for them is what samadhi is like and what moksha is ultimately like, where your individuality is completely gone and Brahman or God alone remains. And notice the theme of darkness too, that you cannot know God, that God is so far beyond, that reappears here. In the symbol for Om, the sacred syllable, you can see this too. The syllable for Om, they put various different interpretations on, but this one I'm showing you here just shows how they can find mystical significance in a symbol like Om, the waking, dreaming, and sleepless state. Om is a prayer syllable which is thought to encompass the divine nature itself when sung, when hummed. It's a little bit similar to the term Yahweh for Jews, which is a sacred name for God. But for the Jews, you can't pronounce it. It was only pronounced once a year by the high priest, as I'm going to tell you more about in Judaism. But for Hindus, anybody can say that, and it quasi-sacramentally brings God present today. Lastly, for the yogas, we have bhakti, the path of devotion. Bhakti yoga would almost seem to contradict Jnana yoga, at least, because it says that he who worships God must stand distinct from him. Pray no more for utter oneness with God. Mother and child are two, if not, where is the love? God is as your mother, you have to be distinct from him if you want to love him, Bhakti yoga says. So to speak in terms of G.K. Chesterton, you might think of Jnana yoga as God or philosophers, but this Bhakti yoga would be the gods. In Bhakti yoga, you choose a god or gods to worship, and these are personal to you, they're your own choice, and you see them as aspects of the one God. So at root and at bottom, maybe they are monotheists, but these are just aspects. This is where you get Hindu myth. And I have a rich assortment of myths to talk about and many pictures and illustrations to show you. If anybody knows anything about Hinduism, they usually know the Hindu Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Not the exact same thing as the Christian Trinity, but it is a fairly powerful figure to show how religions seem to want to have threeness in God and oneness in God. Brahma is the creator. Don't confuse him with Brahman, the Godhead, God's nature. Vishnu is the sustainer, and Shiva is the destroyer. You don't have a destroyer God in Christianity, do you? Well, wait a second. What about the thing called the flood? So there is some parallel there. At any rate, it's not the same as the Christian Trinity. It would be more akin to the Christian heresy called modalism, in which the early heretics thought that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were three different aspects of the one God. He may appear as a father, or as a son, or as the Spirit, but it's really only one person, say the modalists. Today, the god Brahma, you don't see worshipped too much. He's replaced by the great mother goddess Mahadevi in her various forms. Brahma would be more like the deist god, the clockmaker of the Enlightenment, who winds up the clock and lets it go, but no longer has anything to do with the world today. And seeing that there are mother gods and father gods, you have, again, a similar phenomenon to what we saw in Greece with Father Uranos and Mother Gaia. This picture of the Trimurti, or the Trinity, has the three faces, and sometimes I've noted that there's a fourth face that's hidden. Maybe that goes to show that there's always a part of God you can't see. And then this other picture has the three heads all coming off of one body, but all looking the same way. And then this is one of my favorites. It's the god Shiva. On the left side, you have Shiva dancing with his fire and drum, the dance of destruction that destroys the world. It sounds bad, but the spiritual interpretation of that is that he destroys the world of Maya, that is, the world of illusion. When they pray to him, they're not asking for him literally to come and burn down the world, but to destroy the illusions in their hearts. And much like when we pray to God in the Psalms to destroy our enemies and to vindicate us, we don't want that literally. We want that spiritually to overcome Satan. And this statue on the right shows the dual nature of Shiva. You have male body part and female body part from Tamil Nadu in South India, showing that God contains the archetypes of male and female. At this point, I want to go into Christianity, as I said I would do earlier in the course, and how we too show that God has these characteristics. I'm putting up a picture of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem and the gate of the city, which I'll get back to in discussing Islam probably again. But as you overlook that, I'm taking this picture from a church in which the altar has this picture of the hen. And that hen is Jesus, who longs to take his brood under his wings. So Jesus himself uses a feminine image to show his compassion and his love. St. Paul speaks of the Holy Spirit and his milk. Well, newsflash, mothers give milk, not fathers. So again, we don't pray to God as mother, but God contains all the perfections of male and female. On the female goddess side, this is the goddess Kali, who is very different from our God. On the left, you have a temple to her, which we visited in India. And on the right is one of many icons. You can see here what she's holding. She's holding a skull at the top right. She has a bowl with the blood of the skull dripping into it, a trident, a skirt of arms, and a necklace of heads. And she's standing on a guy, which is her consort, Shiva. And Shiva has 3 wives, Kali and Durga, who are dark goddesses, and then Parvati, who's the nice one. As Smith tells you guys in the reading, Kali destroys the evil in us, just like Shiva in destroying the world destroys illusion. Some people, of course, interpret it literally. You always are going to have your traditionalist, so to speak. Not that tradition is a bad thing at all, but the people who will stick to the ways it was thousands of years ago and still go around killing people in the name of Kali because they think she needs sacrifice. Most Hindus have evolved beyond that to realize that we should interpret this thing spiritually instead. And, the Kali temple is quite an experience when I went there and got to see what was going on. And the goat sacrifices too in India. I asked my Hindu guide why they do these goat sacrifices, and he said, well, the goat can't cut off its own head, but in cutting off the goat's head instead of yours, you can't sacrifice your own ego. Then you give the goat immediate release from samsara, reincarnation, and then you identify with that goat because you are indeed one in substance with the goat. And so the prayer to Kali to cut off your head and the goat sacrifice are interesting illustrations of the same phenomenon. This picture here is a Shiva lingam, a symbol of the male body part, which I mentioned back in discussing Chesterton. On the right, this is the picture of a guy who is worshiping at it, and the left one is a more decorated picture I found on the web to show that the fertility is linked up with the worship, as you see oftentimes in ancient religions, including the Canaanite religion that Judaism had to conquer. Then you have Ganesha, the elephant god. The story of Ganesha goes something like this, that I can't remember who it was. I think it was Vishnu who made an oath, and he had to cut off a person's head. Well, he cut off his son's head, and he put the closest head he found back on it, which was an elephant. And the chart I put up here shows that they all have different symbolisms, and you can take a look at this slide for yourself to see those. But Ganesha is a very popular god among Hindus, and people will cry out to Ganesha and have statues of him in their homes. And I like to see how people would say the names of the gods. Like, I heard a lady, when she was sneezing, she'd say, "O Ram," or "O Krishna," or "O something." And I realized that's the same as like saying "God bless you." These gods have a role in their lives that is parallel in many ways to what we find when people cry out to the Blessed Virgin or something. This picture of Ganesha I really like because it's from the great city of Jaipur, and it's on a magnificent building that has these mosaics that are made out of naturally dyed materials, and Ganesha is blue because that's the color of the sky and eternity. And you'll sometimes see him blue, but usually you see Krishna, the god, as blue to show his divinity and infinity. Here you have a picture of the Hanuman monkey god temple I told you about in Delhi, and that's his mouth that you have to enter into, and you throw your shoes outside in a rack, and you go in there and don't know what you're getting yourself into. Here is a picture of the Lakshmi temple in Delhi. It's a more modern temple. That's the one I took the swastika image from, and just to show you an example of the outside architecture. And down here you have some temples in Mahabalipuram in South India that date back to at least 1,500 years old. And the bottom of that picture is a pool that would have had water in it for purifications. In this picture, you can see my third eye they put on me, and I kept it on for a little while so I could get a picture of it. The third eye can mean different things. If it's above, up there where it is on my forehead, it's probably just decorative, or it's for auspicious luck, good luck. If it's right between your eyes, it's probably meant to symbolize interior enlightenment, so a third mystical eye where you see God. In women, they might have an additional dot above, which indicates they're married. You may see vertical lines on people's head to indicate they're a devotee of Shiva, and various other things that are just there for decoration. I want to talk about the appropriateness or not of attending a Hindu ceremony or any ceremony, since I'm offering this for extra credit in this class, and what you should actually be doing. Paul brings the question up in 1 Corinthians 10 of whether you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. And they offered me this little sweet dessert in there, and I didn't eat it because I thought, this is kind of funky. I don't know if I should do this. Here's what Paul says. Therefore, my beloved, shun the worship of idols. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. Wow, Paul's strong. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If any of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question. But if someone says to you, this meat has been offered in sacrifice, then out of consideration for the man who informed you, and for conscience's sake, I mean his conscience, not yours, do not eat it. For why should my liberty be determined by another man's scruples? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. And he goes on also 1 Corinthians 8 and has a more positive view of it, in which he basically says that it's not sinful itself to eat meat if it's been sacrificed to an idol, but for the sake of his brother that he doesn't want to give scandal to, he shouldn't do it. The reason I quote this here is when we do visits to interreligious services or a different religion, we can't go and receive communion at a different church that's not Catholic. If you're Catholic, you can't receive Hindu sacrifices and things like that. And at least if someone's around you who'd be scandalized, you shouldn't do it. Whether these are being offered to demons is another question. I suspect some of them might be, to use Checherson's category, but other times it might be more just to the gods. This picture here is of a little shrine inside a shop next to our hotel in Varanasi, and this is very common because religion pervades the whole culture to see these in hotels and shops. And this picture is some flowers and different things that people would offer to Shiva. Some of the flowers are lotus flowers. The lotus is the national symbol of India, and it has a great a great symbolism, because it has beauty and represents non-attachment. The non-attachment's really cool. It's rooted in the mud but floats on the water without becoming wet or muddy. It symbolizes then how you should live in the world in order to gain release from rebirth, but don't be attached to your surroundings. And so the Bhagavad Gita says that you should perform your duty without attachment, surrendering the results to the Supreme Lord, unafflicted by sinful action, as the lotus leaf is untouched by water. Here's a picture of the lotus leaf under a cross on a stamp, to show how the cross, when we evangelized in India, was taken up within the culture in a way they could understand, and the lotus, referring to infinity and purity and these type of things, was incorporated into Christianity too. The list of things I could talk about goes on and on. I'm going to keep on a couple more pictures before I go to talk about avatars. This is a cow. Cows just be hanging out in the streets. The cows are sacred for Hindus. So some people don't drink milk. Many Hindus, of course, don't eat beef. And the cows just get to do whatever they want. Here you have a cow in a train station. And they're just walking around, doing whatever they want to do. And this cow happened to kick some dirt up in people's faces because there's big mounds of dirt and construction just sitting around in the train station. Now for the avatars. The avatars are the incarnations of the god Vishnu to save the world. A couple examples are Krishna and Rama. The Bhagavad Gita tells the story of the warrior Arjuna and the god Krishna and their dialogue over whether Arjuna should fight in this great battle. And to briefly summarize it, Krishna tells him, you should fight, even though it's your cousins you're fighting against. And don't worry whether you're going to die, because at the end of the day, your Atman cannot die. You'll just pass on. Well, the spiritual sense of the story and its real meaning is the dialogue between the warrior and the god is really an interior dialogue between oneself with a little s and the big S self that dwells within. The other story is the Ramayana with Rama and the goddess Sita, his wife. And she's stolen by this demon, and the story of how Rama rescues her with the help of the monkey god Hanuman is kind of fun. But these were the first incarnations of the god Vishnu and his wife Lakshmi. The spiritual exegesis of this story is fun, and I was told this in a new way by my Hindu friend in India. He says that when Hanuman, the god, jumps to Sri Lanka across the ocean from India, this symbolizes the mind jumping to God. He says it should really be called the Sita Yana. It's more with the protagonist of Sita. Because Sita represents God and Rama us. Rama goes all throughout India looking for Sita, but wherever he goes, she's not there. Neti, neti. God is not this, not that, not here, not there. God, or Sita, plays a game of hide and seek with us. In the Christian exegesis of the Song of Songs, one of the most commented on books of the Bible ever, the great mystics see in the bridegroom's hiding an attempt to get the bride to desire him all the more. And that explains for a Hindu and for a Christian why God sometimes doesn't show his face to us, to increase our desire and our love for him. Even Jesus is viewed as an avatar by the Hindus, and Buddha as well. Buddha is interesting because he rejected Hinduism, as we're going to see. Jesus is interesting because we think he's the only incarnation, whereas Hindus think he's one of many. Christianity is a particularly well-lit path, but it's not the only one. And the apostles, some see as gurus. They're wise teachers because they had a direct experience of Jesus. Whereas we would say, just like Ratzinger pointed out, the prophet or evangelist is not great because of his experience. It's because he is used as a mouthpiece despite his sinfulness. And they're not great figures. They're really weak, actually, to show God's grace. But Hindus have a great respect for Christians generally. My friend Sri, I was surprised when he bowed down and touched or kissed the priest's feet, who was our guide in South India. This picture here is of a tree at the Kali temple in Calcutta, where the great Hindu mystic Ramakrishna is said to have prayed to Christ for 3 days, and then Christ appeared and embraced him. And of course Christ tells them that all religions are the same paths, which we don't agree with, but that's kind of interesting. The movie Life of Pi brings this out as well, which if I didn't bring up already, I'm going to, and I seem to recall that I did bring that up actually. But in the Life of Pi here, you have kind of story about myths and how they bring people in a way that facts can't bring them to God, and how Vishnu in particular is an ocean and we're his dream. The universe is Krishna's mouth, and there's a point in that whenever he's on the ship and drowning where he thanks Vishnu for having come in the form of a fish and saving him. So that aspect of the story Life of Pi, I just find kind of interesting because it illustrates the avatars, and that the myths have a way of speaking to the people and relating to God that abstract words would not do. Now moving to a very different topic. We have the traditional stages of life we have to mention really quickly. There are 4 stages of life: student, householder, retirement, and sannyasin. The first 20 years of life, your duty is to learn. Your next 20, to run the house, have kids. Then to retire. And traditionally, you became a forest dweller. Now, people don't always do this, obviously, today, but you went out and meditated. So you used your retirement to try to find God. And then finally, you would return back to the world as a wandering ascetic, a sannyasin or monk. And you see these people sitting outside, like this man in the picture, who are just begging because they've literally renounced everything and are ready to prepare for death and detach themselves completely. We also have to talk about the stations of life, as Smith calls them, that is, the castes. You have 4 castes. The first is the seers or Brahmins. Again, don't confuse Brahmin with Brahma, the creator god, or Brahman, the godhead. These are the intellectual and spiritual leaders. Then you have the administrators. Then you have producers. Those are skilled laborers like artisans or farmers. And then finally the followers, the servants and the unskilled. And you are fixed within these categories. Very difficult to move out of them. And people are proud of their caste if they're high up. I sat on a train, we had an air-conditioned train by the grace of God one time, and these people were telling me how they were Brahmins and very proud of it. But then you have this fifth unofficial caste called the untouchables. These are the people that did some of the most important tasks like the cremation rituals in Varanasi and other things that are important, but they're dirty jobs. Well, there's a myth called the Purusha, the cosmic person, which is served as a justification for the caste system. The cosmic figure Purusha is sacrificed, and out of his different parts are created the different castes. So the followers are created out of his feet, whereas the Brahmins are created out of his head. And this is still around today. There was one train station in the city of Krishna's birth, in which there was a specific room that said for high caste only. And we were able to go sit in that room, which was a little bit out of the, away from the riffraff, if you will, and a little bit cooler. And because we were Europeans or Americans, we fit in the higher caste. Gandhi's move in the middle of the 20th century was to rename the untouchables to God's people, to give them hope that they have the same dignity as everyone else. Next, I want to talk about Hindu prayer in relation to Christian prayer, and this document that's optional, some aspects of Christian meditation by the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith. A lot of what we said about Hinduism should sound like it has a lot of parallels to Christianity, but Christian meditation is defined as a personal, profound, intimate dialogue with the Trinity. We aren't God. We dialogue with God. Number two, we believe in divinization, as we'll see in our Christian section at the end of the course. We become God by grace, the church fathers say. But we're still distinct from God. We don't become a blob of God. Three, this is all through grace. It's a gift from God. We are not God by nature. Four, this is the one that's relevant to a lot of people today. Can you incorporate Eastern methods? Can you do yoga? Yes and no. If it's devoid of its philosophical foundation and it is just physical exercises and you reformulate it in accordance with Christian principles, then yes. In fact, I know a group of women who started an organization called Petra Fitness, which they don't put it this way, but it's essentially Catholic yoga. But it's extremely Catholic and Orthodox, as far as I know. We can learn from Eastern Christian mysticism too. We oftentimes forget that Christianity is not just Roman. There are also Byzantine Catholics and Catholics living in India, which have great methods of prayer to offer that we don't take advantage of in the West. And then finally, the document says that we ought to beware of the danger of mistaking holiness for good feelings. And this is the danger in doing yoga. People will think they've achieved peace and enlightenment or what have you, but they really just are good feelings. Holiness, according to the saints, is measured by the charity that your prayer produces, not by the good feelings or thoughts you have in it. The other document relevant to this is one by the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue called A Christian Reflection on New Age. New Age is where you have Eastern practices imported in a piecemeal manner and then reinterpreted to suit Westerners. An example of New Age I had in my life was I was in Chartres, famous medieval town in France, and I had a hard time finding a hotel when I arrived that night back in 2006. I ran into these Americans out in front of the great cathedral, and they said, "Are you here to worship the Mother Goddess?" And I replied, "What are you talking about?" They said, "Yeah, we're here for the New Age conference." And I realized, oh my gosh, I found the people for the first time in my life that worship Mary. So they'll take a goddess and put Western categories like Mary on it. But God for New Age is generally impersonal, not somebody you have a relationship with. He's the God within you. That's why people in the West like that expression, namaste. The Atman is within you. They believe in reincarnation. But the thing I want to observe is reincarnation is interpreted as a good thing for them, whereas it is most certainly not a good thing for a Hindu. So in sum, beware of the claims of New Age and be judicious about your approach to yoga but we do have a lot to learn from the East. Lastly, I have some pictures to show you from my experience in Varanasi, the great holy city, the holiest city in India. And I just think this is a great place to conclude our discussion of Hinduism by showing you their most important rituals and what all Hindus would love to do as a means to end their life. In this picture you have the priests in this great ceremony they hold every evening of the year, doing a ceremony called Aarti on the Ganga, the Ganges River. And in this one you have our hotel room. We were able to book a hotel looking right over the river. And these things called ghats, the little ports or the steps you go down to get to the boats. And we were able to book a hour-long boat ride here down the Ganges River. And you can see these lights in the distance. Those are cremations taking place at that very time. And at the burning ghat, the burning port, people are burned so that the 5 elements in them will dissolve, and but not all the way, because it could delay reincarnation. You want to have immediate samsara release, so they'll actually burn people only halfway and then release their body in the river. The Ganges is named after the goddess Ganga, Ganga Mother. The water that starts in the Himalayan mountains flows down to the Ganges, and the Ganges serves many functions. It's for burial, like we see here, for baths, for rituals. It's also a bathroom. It's rank, and it's problematic, but that is what it is. And some more pictures of the fire up close. Some we took, some from the internet here, and click through those. A couple other great pictures. Unfortunately, sometimes people in the past, at least, would burn themselves if their husband died. One neat thing is a priest told me the story of his mother, who is Hindu. They would see the god Ram as the groom because her husband was already dead, and she was his bride. So the wife would dress in wedding clothes before cremation to be united spousally to her great lord. Here's some more pictures of the incense that they have on the river every evening, and then there are the people looking out upon it, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, I like this picture that has these tea lights that people float out on the river for their prayers. It reminds me of votive offerings in Catholicism. To conclude, I have a few questions and musings I want to share with you to get you thinking, bring this up in discussion forums. One, is Bhakti Yoga the same religion even as Jnana Yoga? You've seen the great diversity of Hinduism in this hour-long lecture. Are the two compatible? Number two, is Hinduism's optimism about the salvation of all people possible only because of their belief in reincarnation? In other words, they say you can do what you want, but they have that luxury because you live multiple lives. Does Christianity put more of a moral imperative to be good, to be holy, because you only get one chance? The answer would seem to be yes, but a lot of Christians don't recall this, and we live as if we're going to live forever. Number three, might there be a parallel in Christianity with the notion of purgatory? In other words, their belief in reincarnation just may be a ray of truth and goodness that lets us see that when you die, you do need purification. If you're unclean, we don't believe you go back into the world as another body, but you had to go to a state where you're purified until you achieve heaven. They're getting at that, I think. The other thing is their term reincarnation. Compare that to the term resurrection. Resurrection, what do? You get your body back again. You're reincarnated, but not in the way they mean. But even that might be a pointer towards Christianity, even though it has its flaws. And then finally, In Hinduism, when you perform the sacred rituals in the Ganges of dipping in there, they see it as a kind of rebirth, and then that's a foretaste of their rebirth into a different body. Well, we have demythologized that in Christianity, and Christ has shown the true rebirth that comes through baptism. So that dipping in the Ganges River, purifying, that's natural man in religion, recognizing the need for symbolism and the need for purity and death to one's old self and rising to new life. But Christianity has that in spades, and once again fulfills all the other religions.